The phone vibrated against my ear, slick with the sweat of my palms. I was gasping, my voice caught in a jagged sob, ready to tell my husband that our world had just ended. "Simon?" I whispered, my heart fracturing, but he didn't hear me. He was laughing, a cold, sharp sound that sliced through the sterile hospital air. "Is she broken yet?" he asked someone on his end. "The doctor said the accident looked perfect. Once the insurance clears for the loss of pregnancy, we're out of this debt. I told you I'd handle the brat." My blood turned to liquid nitrogen. I wasn't just losing my baby, I was married to a monster who had just tried to kill it. Before I continue, I need your help reaching 1,000 subscribers. If you love shocking family betrayal and revenge stories like this, hit that subscribe button. And I'm curious, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. Are you cozied up at home, commuting, working out? I love knowing where my stories find you. My name is Layla, and until 3 minutes ago, I believed I was the luckiest woman in the world. I am a landscape architect who spent 5 years trying to build a family with a man I thought was my soulmate. I didn't know that while I was planting gardens, he was digging my grave. Before the shadow of that clinic phone call, my life was painted in the soft, golden hues of a dream I thought would never come true. 5 months ago, I sat on the edge of a crinkly paper-covered exam table, my breath hitching as the cool gel touched my skin. Simon sat beside me, his fingers interlaced with mine so tightly I could feel his pulse. When the rhythmic, thumping sound of the heartbeat finally filled the small room, Simon didn't just smile, he broke down. He buried his face in my shoulder, his tears dampening my gown, whispering that he had never felt a love this pure. "This is our fresh start, Layla," he choked out, his eyes shimmering with what I believed was holy devotion. He pulled a brochure from his pocket, a sprawling Victorian house in a quiet suburb with a wraparound porch and a tire swing. He promised me that by the 3rd trimester, we would be out of our cramped apartment and nesting in a sanctuary built for 3. Looking back at his trembling hands and the way he kissed my knuckles, I realize now it wasn't a celebration of life. It was the practiced rehearsal of a man setting his bait. The suburban dream Simon promised didn't come without a stack of paperwork, which he laid out across our kitchen table just weeks after that first ultrasound. He looked exhausted, rubbing his temples, while claiming that his work as an architect had become volatile, and he couldn't sleep for fear of leaving us unprotected. "If anything happens to you or the baby, Layla, I need to know you're taken care of," he murmured, sliding a thick blue folder toward me. It wasn't standard life insurance. It was a specialized, high-premium policy with an aggressive rider for accidental loss of life or catastrophic pregnancy complications. My heart swelled at his supposed selflessness, seeing his furrowed brow as a sign of a nesting father's anxiety. I questioned the high monthly cost, but he silenced me with a gentle kiss on the forehead, insisting that our family's security was worth every penny of the sacrifice. I signed those pages with a hand that trembled from affection, never once suspecting that the ink was actually a down payment on my demise. He tucked the folder away with a sudden, sharp efficiency, his eyes darting toward the window, as if he were already calculating the value of the tragedy he was about to set in motion. The ink on those insurance documents was barely dry when Simon came home with a look of frantic, manic excitement. He claimed the city's smog was poisoning my health and that the stress of the impending move was too much for the baby. "Pack a bag, Layla," he insisted, his hands trembling as he showed me a rental confirmation for a cabin tucked deep into the high-altitude pines of the northern range. He sold it as a romantic baby moon, a final sanctuary of peace before our lives changed forever. I felt a twinge of unease when I looked up the coordinates and saw nothing but dense, jagged forest and winding dirt roads. When I pointed out that it was nearly 3 hours from the nearest hospital and completely off the grid, he laughed it off with a dismissive wave. He told me he'd downloaded the maps and that my overthinking was exactly why I needed to disconnect from the world. I allowed myself to be persuaded, mistaking his insistence for protective love. As we drove past the last cell tower and the bars on my phone vanished into a hollow, no-service signal, I didn't realize Simon wasn't taking me to a retreat. He was taking me to a place where no one would hear me scream, The cabin was a hollow shell of cedar and shadows, its silence amplified by the whistling wind through the high-altitude pines. On our second morning, Simon claimed the car was making a strange rattling sound and insisted on checking the engine before we headed out for a walk. I stood at the top of the steep, uncarpeted wooden staircase, adjusting my sweater and preparing to join him. I took one confident step forward, my eyes fixed on the front door, when my ankle suddenly snagged on something invisible and impossibly taut. A thin, translucent wire, no thicker than a strand of fishing line, was anchored across the landing. Before I could even gasp, my center of gravity vanished. The world tilted into a terrifying blur of spinning walls and sharp wooden edges. I felt the sickening thuds as my body collided with each step, the air driven from my lungs with every impact. A blinding, white-hot agony flared in my abdomen, a pain so primal and jagged that it drowned out the sound of my own skull hitting the floorboards at the bottom. As the darkness rushed in to swallow me, my last conscious thought was the sight of the front door slowly creaking open. The world returned to me in agonizing, rhythmic pulses of fluorescent light and the sharp, metallic tang of a sterile room. I was lying on a narrow cot in a clinic that felt more like a converted basement than a medical facility, the walls a jaundiced yellow that seemed to closing in. My hand flew instinctively to my stomach, a cold wave of dread washing over me as I realized the familiar, comforting weight of my pregnancy felt different, heavy and hollow all at once. I scanned the small, dimly lit room for Simon, but his chair was empty, his jacket gone. A nurse with a face like etched granite and eyes that refused to meet mine entered, her footsteps echoing on the linoleum. When I croaked out my husband's name, she didn't offer a smile or a reassuring touch. She simply checked the drip on my IV bag with clinical detachment. "He's gone to the general store to get supplies for your recovery," she said, her voice flat and devoid of warmth. "He said you'd want your own things." She paused at the door, her hand on the light switch. "Dr. Aris is coming in with the results of your scan now. Try to stay still." The door groaned on its hinges, and a man in a rumpled white coat stepped into the dim light. Dr. Aris didn't look like a healer. He looked like a man carrying the weight of 1,000 tragedies. He moved toward my bedside with a leaden gait, his eyes fixed on the clipboard in his hands as if the ink could shield him from my gaze. When he finally looked up, the pity in his expression was a physical blow to my chest. He took a long, shaky breath and reached out to adjust the monitor, though its screen remained a haunting, static black. "I'm so sorry, Layla," he began, his voice barely a rasp in the suffocating stillness of the room. He explained that the trauma from the fall had been too severe, that the placental detachment was absolute. "The pregnancy is over. There was nothing we could do." The words hit me like a second tumble down those wooden stairs, stripping the air from my lungs until I was gasping in a vacuum. A heavy, tomb-like silence settled over the clinic, broken only by the frantic, ragged sound of my own sobbing as the realization took root. The future I had spent 5 years building had just been buried in a rural basement. Dr. Aris handed me a thin, silver flip phone with a hand that seemed to tremble almost as much as mine. "You need to notify your husband immediately, Layla," he said, his voice dropping to a somber whisper. "We need his signature on the discharge and the acknowledgement of loss before we can move you." My fingers fumbled with the buttons, my vision blurred by a fresh salt sting of tears as I dialed the only number I knew by heart. I expected to hear Simon's panicked voice, his breathless reassurance, his shared agony, but when the line clicked open, there was only the sound of the wind whistling through the pines on his end. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words died in my throat as I heard a sharp, callous laugh. "Is she broken yet?" Simon asked someone, his tone stripped of every ounce of the tenderness he'd shown me for years. The doctor said the accident looked perfect. Once the insurance clears for the loss of pregnancy, we're finally out of this debt. I told you I'd handle the brat. The phone felt like a live wire in my hand, burning my skin as the man I loved began to calculate the price of my dead child. 44. I was still clutching the phone, my knuckles white and my soul feeling as though it had been flayed open when the door swung wide. Dr. Aris burst back into the room, his lab coat flapping and his face flushed, a panicked shade of crimson. He was breathless, clutching a new set of folders as if they were a lifeline. "Layla, wait. Stop everything," he stammered, his eyes darting to the monitor. He explained through frantic gasps that the previous technician had botched the file transfer, swapping my results with another patient's chart from earlier that morning. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as he pressed the cold transducer back onto my skin. Then it happened. The steady, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of a heartbeat filled the room once more, louder and more defiant than ever. For a split second, a surge of pure electric joy nearly blinded me. My baby was alive. But as the sound echoed off the yellowed walls, the joy curdled into a terrifying, icy realization. Simon was outside right now, celebrating a death that hadn't happened. He thought the accident was a success. If he found out his plan had failed, he wouldn't just be looking for an insurance payout anymore, he'd be looking to finish the job. The sound of that heartbeat was a miracle, but in this room it felt like a death sentence. Before Dr. Aris could turn toward the door to call out the good news, I lunged forward, my fingers locking around his wrist with a strength born of pure, unadulterated terror. My eyes must have looked hollow, two black pits of desperation, as I pulled him closer until our foreheads nearly touched. "Don't," I rasped, the word tearing at my throat. "If he knows this baby is alive, he will kill us both." The confusion on the doctor's face shifted into a mask of horror as I recounted the words I'd just heard over the phone. The insurance payout, the orchestrated fall, the brat he wanted handled. I told him about the tripwire and the cold, mocking laughter of the man waiting in the hallway. Dr. Aris looked at the monitor, then back at my trembling frame, the professional distance in his eyes shattering into a jagged shard of protective rage. He squeezed my hand back, a silent vow passing between us in the dim light. "You won't hear a thing from me," he whispered, his voice steadying. "As far as the world is concerned, Layla, you are a grieving mother." The heavy door creaked open, and Simon stumbled into the room, his face a practiced mask of devastation. He looked like a man who had just had his soul ripped out, his eyes red-rimmed and his shoulders slumped in a heavy, theatrical display of grief. As he rushed toward my bedside, I felt the air in the small room thicken with his deceit. He collapsed onto the edge of the cot and pulled me into an embrace that felt like the coils of a viper. The smell of his expensive cologne, mixed with the faint scent of the mountain air where he had just been laughing about our demise, made my skin crawl. I squeezed my eyes shut, my entire body stiffening as I fought the violent urge to vomit right onto his designer shoes. He pressed his face into the crook of my neck, his breath hot and smelling of the coffee he'd likely enjoyed while discussing the insurance payout. "I'm here, Layla. I'm so sorry," he murmured, his voice thick with a fake tremor that made my blood boil. Then he leaned closer, his lips brushing my ear as he whispered the most chilling words I'd ever heard. "It's okay, honey. We'll just try again later." The hum of the tires against the winding mountain road felt like a countdown I couldn't stop. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the blurred silhouettes of jagged pines, my hand resting protectively over the secret life still pulsing beneath my skin. Simon was behind the wheel, his theatrical grief from the clinic evaporating with every mile we put between us and Dr. Aris. His fingers tapped a rhythmic, cheerful beat against the leather steering wheel, a stark contrast to the hollow silence I was supposed to be maintaining. "You know, Layla," he started, his voice light, almost breezy. "Maybe this is a sign. We were so stressed about the move, the debt, everything." He glanced at me, his eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger he didn't even bother to hide anymore. He began rambling about the insurance payout, listing off the credit cards he'd clear first, and suggesting a month-long getaway to the coast once the paperwork was finalized. To him, the loss of our child was nothing more than a profitable business transaction, a golden ticket to the life he felt he deserved. I kept my face pressed against the cold glass, biting my tongue until it bled, realizing that the man driving me home wasn't my husband. He was a scavenger picking at the bones of our family. The front door of our apartment had barely clicked shut when Simon ushered me toward the bedroom, his touch now hurried and clinical rather than tender. He insisted I rest and mourn, while he handled the insurance adjusters in the living room. As soon as he left, I pulled my phone from my pocket, my fingers trembling as I opened the security app for the nursery monitor I'd installed in a fit of nesting excitement weeks ago. The camera angle was wide, capturing the hallway and the open door of my dressing room. My breath hitched as the live feed flickered to life. Simon wasn't on the phone with an adjuster. He was standing over my jewelry box with a woman I recognized instantly. Brooke, his firm's lead accountant. I watched, paralyzed, as they scoured through my grandmother's pearls and my diamond studs, tossing pieces onto the bed with the efficiency of common thieves. Brooke leaned into him, her hand resting on his chest with a sickening familiarity. "The policy covers the pregnancy loss," she whispered, her voice amplified by the monitor's microphone, "but these will cover our first month in the Maldives." Simon laughed, the same jagged sound I'd heard at the clinic, and kissed her forehead before dropping my wedding ring into her palm. The sight of Brooke sliding my wedding ring into her palm was the final spark that turned my grief into a cold, calculating fire. While Simon was busy celebrating in the other room, I crawled toward his desk, my hands trembling as I reached for his laptop. I knew his password. It was the date of our wedding, a day that now felt like a pact signed in blood. I bypassed the superficial folders and dug deep into his encrypted browser history, my eyes stinging as the screen's blue light revealed a nightmare of red numbers and frantic emails. Simon hadn't just been unlucky with work. He had gambled away nearly $400,000 in volatile cryptocurrency markets, using funds that didn't belong to him. The business partner, Brooke, wasn't just his mistress. She was his accomplice in a massive embezzlement scheme at his firm. A final notice from an internal auditor sat in his inbox, giving him 48 hours to replace the missing funds or face a criminal indictment. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The accident at the cabin wasn't just about greed. It was a desperate, homicidal move to stay out of a prison cell. To Simon, my baby's life was nothing more than a bailout. The cold realization of Simon's financial ruin made every interaction in our apartment feel like a dance on a razor's edge. I noticed a subtle shift in his behavior. He had become obsessively attentive, insisting on bringing me a special herbal blend tea every night to help me sleep through the grief. He would stand in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light, watching with predatory stillness until I drained the mug. I started to wonder why my limbs felt like lead, and my thoughts were constantly shrouded in a thick, gray fog. One Tuesday, as the steam rose from the porcelain, I waited for him to go to the bathroom to wash his hands. In one fluid, silent motion, I swapped our identical mugs. I watched him return and drink the entire contents while he talked about starting over. Within 20 minutes, his words began to slur, his eyelids drooping until he collapsed into the armchair, fully clothed. Simon didn't move for 14 hours. He didn't just sleep. He drifted into a drug-induced coma so deep I could have screamed and he wouldn't have blinked. He wasn't caring for me. He was chemically shackling me, keeping me sedated and compliant so I wouldn't ask questions before the insurance check arrived. The doorbell chimed with a cheerful, invasive ring that shattered the fragile silence of my afternoon. I watched through the cracked bedroom door as Brooke sauntered in, carrying a gourmet takeout bag like a trophy. She was the picture of a concerned colleague, her voice pitched in a high melodic sympathy that made my skin crawl. "I just wanted to make sure you both were eating," she cooed, her eyes darting toward the hallway where I was supposed to be sedated and sleeping. I crept toward the kitchen, my feet silent on the hardwood, and paused just out of sight. The air in the room was thick with the smell of expensive saffron and betrayal. Simon's hands were on her waist, pulling her flush against him with a hunger he hadn't shown me in years. "How much longer, Simon?" she whispered, her fingers tracing the collar of his shirt. He leaned down, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that felt like a knife in my back. "The paperwork is in motion. As soon as Layla fails to recover from the emotional toll of the loss, we're gone. The insurance pays out double for a secondary health decline. We'll be on the coast by next month." I stood in the shadows, my hand clutching the doorframe, realizing that my grief was merely a bridge to my funeral. The shadows in our apartment seemed to grow longer as I began my silent counter-offensive, moving through the rooms like a ghost in my own life. I stopped playing the sedated victim and started becoming his waking nightmare. It began small. A drawer left slightly ajar, a laptop charger moved just an inch from where he'd left it. Then, I upped the ante. One morning, while Simon was in the shower whistling a tune that sounded far too celebratory, I placed a crisp, highlighted printout of the accidental loss insurance policy directly in the center of the mahogany dining table. I circled the clause regarding investigative delays in a bleeding red ink that looked like a warning. When he walked out, towel draped over his shoulders, his eyes landed on the paper, and his entire posture recoiled. The smug, relaxed curve of his mouth flattened into a thin, white line of panic. He spent the rest of the afternoon pacing the hallway, his phone gripped so tight his knuckles turned ghostly. He kept glancing at me, searching my blank, grieving expression for a flicker of awareness, but I gave him nothing but a hollow stare. His predatory confidence was rotting into a frantic, twitching paranoia. And for the first time, I saw the predator begin to feel like the prey. The phone rang in the middle of a suffocating dinner, the sound echoing like a gunshot against the fine china Simon had insisted on using to celebrate our recovery. I watched his hand freeze over the wine bottle as he checked the caller ID. When he saw the clinic's local area code, his face drained of color, his eyes darting toward me with a sharp, suspicious intensity. He answered, his voice a strained, melodic imitation of a worried spouse. On the other end, Dr. Aris delivered his lines with the precision of a master actor, his voice crackling through the speaker just enough for me to hear the words, "unforeseen complications," and "critical follow-up required." The doctor claimed that the blood work from the night of the fall showed an alarming anomaly that could suggest internal hemorrhaging, a medical emergency that mandated an immediate return to the rural facility. I watched Simon's predatory confidence dissolve into a frantic, twitching mess. He wasn't worried about my life. He was terrified that a second examination would reveal the heartbeat he thought he'd silenced. He had no choice but to take the bait. As he shoved his chair back, his knuckles white against the table, I realized the trap was finally set. The air in the apartment felt thick, like a storm was about to break, as Simon stood in the doorway of the unfinished nursery. He wasn't looking at the crib I'd lovingly picked out. His eyes were fixed on the small, ceramic dish where I'd hidden the sedative tea bags he'd been forcing on me. He walked over, his movements slow and jagged, and crushed one of the dry bags between his fingers, the dark herbs spilling like dirt onto the white rug. When he turned to face me, the mask of the grieving, supportive husband didn't just slip, it disintegrated. His features contorted into a snarl of pure, predatory malice, his eyes turning into cold, black voids. "You think you're so clever, Layla," he hissed, the sound echoing off the empty walls. He stepped into my personal space, pinning me against the changing table until the wood dug into my spine. He didn't look like a man anymore. He looked like a monster who had finally grown tired of the charade. "You've been playing me, haven't you? Swapping the cups, leaving the papers? You're not mourning. You're waiting." He grabbed my chin, his grip bruisingly tight, and I realized in that moment that the man who had promised to protect me was the only thing I needed protection from. Adrenaline surged through my veins like liquid fire, granting me a momentary burst of strength I didn't know I possessed. As Simon's grip tightened, I slammed my heel into his shin and shoved him backward into the nursery. Before he could recover, I threw the heavy oak door shut and turned the exterior deadbolt I'd installed for the baby's future safety. His roar of fury echoed through the wood, followed by the sickening thud of his shoulder hitting the frame. But I was already sprinting. I burst through the front door into the freezing night air, fumbling for my keys as I reached our SUV. I threw the car into reverse, my heart hammering against my ribs, but when I slammed my foot down to stop at the end of the driveway, the pedal went limp, hitting the floorboard with a hollow metallic clack. The vehicle rolled helplessly toward the ravine. He hadn't just drugged me, he'd ensured I could never leave. I yanked the emergency brake, fishtailing the car into a snowbank, and scrambled out just as the nursery window shattered above me. With no other choice, I plunged into the black, jagged maw of the woods, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I clawed through the underbrush toward the distant, flickering light of Victor's house. My lungs burned with the icy air as I broke through the final line of skeletal trees, the porch light of Victor's cabin shimmering like a false star. I hammered on the heavy oak door, my hands raw and bleeding from the thorns, until the lock finally clicked. Victor, a man who had been Simon's closest confidant since college, stood there with a look of practiced concern. "Layla? My God, what happened?" he gasped, pulling me into the warmth of his foyer. I collapsed against the wall, sobbing out a fragmented story of the accident and the nursery door, my body shaking with the sudden shift from the freezing woods to the heated interior. He steered me toward the kitchen, promising to call the police, but as he reached for the wall-mounted phone, my gaze snagged on the granite countertop. Sitting next to a half-empty bottle of expensive bourbon was a familiar leather fob. Simon's spare car keys, the ones he claimed he'd lost months ago. Beside them lay a printed map of the local ravines, with several cleanup spots circled in the same red ink I had used for my own warning. The warmth of the house vanished, replaced by a paralyzing, soul-deep chill. Victor wasn't my savior. He was the shadow Simon used to hide the bodies. The air in Victor's kitchen turned to ice as the front door groaned open and Simon stepped inside. His clothes torn from his escape through the nursery window, but his expression disturbingly calm. They didn't even look at me. They looked through me, as if I were already a ghost haunting their floorboards. I slumped against the cabinets, my hands surreptitiously sliding into my pocket to thumb the record button on my phone. Thinking they had finally cornered their prey in a house with no exits, the two men began to speak with a sickening, casual transparency. Simon poured himself a glass of the bourbon, his hand steady. "The wire worked perfectly, Victor, but she's tougher than she looks," he remarked, his voice devoid of the grief he'd performed at the clinic. Victor nodded, leaning against the counter next to the map of the ravines. "The fall should have finished it. Now we have to make the secondary health decline look like a tragic accident here." They spoke of the embezzlement, the staged tripwire at the cabin, and the exact spot in the woods where they intended to leave my body before dawn. Every word, every cold calculation of my murder was being etched into digital memory. Simon took a slow, deliberate step toward me, the half-empty bourbon glass catching the dim light of Victor's kitchen like a jagged tooth. His eyes were wide, fixed on my throat with a terrifying, singular focus. "It's a shame, Layla," he whispered, his voice dropping to a low, melodic hum of pure sociopathy. "You just wouldn't stay down." Beside him, Victor reached for a heavy iron fire poker near the hearth, his face a mask of cold, professional indifference. Just as Simon's muscles coiled and he lunged forward, his hands outstretched to silence the truth forever, the night was shattered by a sudden, deafening wail. Blue and red strobes erupted against the frosted window panes, slicing through the shadows of the cabin like a serrated blade. The complications Dr. Aris had described weren't just a medical lie. They were a coded signal to the local sheriff, a silent alarm we had coordinated the moment I gripped his wrist in the clinic. The front door was kicked inward with a splintering crash before Simon could even touch me. Heavy boots thundered across the hardwood as the sheriff's voice boomed over the chaos, demanding they drop their weapons. The predators froze, trapped in the blinding glare of justice. The fluorescent lights of the interrogation room were humbless and blinding, reflecting off the cold metal table where Simon sat, his practiced composure finally beginning to fray at the edges. Across from him, the sheriff didn't speak. He simply pressed play on my phone. The room filled with the jagged, digitized sound of Simon's own voice, his callous laughter, the detailed plan to handle the brat, and the cold calculation of the insurance payout. Simon's face turned a sickly, translucent gray as he realized his own words had become his shackles. The final blow came when the door opened, and Brooke was led in, her eyes red-rimmed, but her expression sharp with self-preservation. Without a single glance at the man she had supposedly loved, she laid out the entire embezzlement scheme, handing over encrypted files and offshore account numbers in exchange for full immunity. She traded his life for her freedom in less than 10 minutes. I watched through the one-way glass as Simon's predatory pride collapsed into a hollow, trembling heap. His career was a smoldering ruin, his freedom was a memory, and the misery he had tried to cash in on had become the very weight that would bury him for the rest of his life. The sterile, white light of the city hospital felt like a benediction after the suffocating darkness of Victor's cabin. I lay back on the crinkling paper of the exam table, the cool gel on my skin a soothing balm compared to the jagged terror of the night before. Beside me, Dr. Eris adjusted the monitor, his face no longer a mask of professional distance, but one of quiet, triumphant joy. As the wand glided across my abdomen, the rhythmic galloping thrum of a heartbeat filled the room, a sound that was no longer a secret to be guarded with my life, but a declaration of victory. On the screen, the grainy gray image resolved into the clear, unmistakable silhouette of a miracle. The baby kicked, a tiny, defiant movement that brought tears to my eyes, blurring the sight of the healthy, growing life within me. Dr. Eris squeezed my hand, a silent acknowledgement of the war we had fought and won together. The loss Simon had toasted with bourbon and celebrated with his mistress had never existed. It was the phantom he had chased straight into a prison cell. He had gambled everything on a death that never came, and in his greed, he had authored his own total undoing. The air in the garden was sweet with the scent of blooming jasmine and damp earth, a sanctuary I had designed myself to be a living testament to peace. 6 months had passed since the night the blue and red lights cut through the mountain fog, and the world now felt vibrant and clean. I stood among the rows of lavender, my fingers brushing the soft petals as a courier approached with the finality I had been waiting for. I opened the heavy envelope and pulled out the legal notice. Simon had been sentenced to 25 years for embezzlement and attempted murder. The words on the page felt like the final clink of a key in a lock, sealing his fate while unlocking my own. I let out a long, steady breath and placed my hand over the firm, rounded curve of my belly. Beneath my palm, a strong, rhythmic kick answered me, a tiny warrior who had survived the shadows alongside his mother. As the sun began to crest the horizon, painting the sky in defiant streaks of gold and crimson, I looked out over the life I had rebuilt from the ashes. The man who thought he could outsmart me was a memory in a cell, and the underdog he had dismissed didn't just survive, she had won the war. He tried to bury my future for money, but now he'll spend his life buried in a cell, while the child he tried to erase calls me Mom. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more shocking family betrayal and revenge stories like this one, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one.